Moving on to the latent trait theory is another developmental theory which explains delinquency from a developmental perspective. Latent trait theory states certain personality types and traits are the cause of criminal behavior. Personality traits which lead to delinquency are inherited and acquired early in life through childhood experiences. The latent trait theory suggests that delinquents are born with certain traits that make them prone to delinquency or criminality. For those not born with those traits, it is also possible to acquire them early in life. Some of these latent traits include impulsivity, defective intelligence, genetic abnormalities, imbalances of the physical chemical functioning of the brain, which is caused by drugs or chemicals and even injuries, as well as personality disorders. The latent trait theory suggests that humans are controlled by a fundamental main trait, which controls one's behavior. Some supporters of this theory believe that this main trait can change over the course of one's lifetime. Others suggest that this main trait remains stable and inflexible over the course of one's life. Further, one's environment can influence how this trait takes shape during the course of a lifetime. If opportunity to commit crime presents itself, then individuals who are already prone to delinquent behavior due to the presence of a major latent trait will most likely turn to it. However, people do age out of delinquency because as they mature, there are simply fewer opportunities to commit such acts and greater inducements to remain quote-unquote straight, like getting married, having kids, jobs, and responsible friends. Some view this theory as incorporating other trait theories, personality and temper, and also incorporating the rational choice theory, opportunity and suitability of targets. Crime and Human Nature. It's a book. I'll summarize it. It's referenced in our course book. You can, if you're interested in further information on this topic, I suggest it's a good read. You can find it on Amazon. One of the most widely renowned books, as I said, and it was written by two researchers, criminologists Wilson and Herrnstein. Crime and Human Nature is the name of the book. The argument made throughout the book is that personal traits like genetics, IQ, and body build may actually outweigh the importance of social variables as predictors of criminality. Their integrated theory includes elements of biology, sociology, personality, rational choice, structure, and social process theories. According to Wilson and Herrnstein, all human behavior is determined by its perceived consequences. The weighing of potential gains and losses are done for certain behaviors to determine which will be acted on. And this is the function of the rational choice that we already talked about last chapter. The larger the perception of rewards, the greater the tendency to commit the crime. The theory is integrative because it assumes that biological and psychological traits influence the choice-making process. They find a link between a person's decision to commit crime and such biosocial factors as low IQ, body type, and genetics, i.e. parents' criminality. Psychological traits, including impulsivity, extroversion, are also related. These traits, quote-unquote traits, do not mean a person with them will be a criminal, but all things being equal, those who have them are more likely to choose crime over non-crime. Wilson and Herrnstein did not ignore the social factors that are known to impact criminality either. They feel that biosocial, psychological, and social conditions can all work together to influence behavior patterns. And they have assembled a vast amount of support for their notions and theory, but there are critics of their work that point out that much of their supporting evidence is plagued by sampling inadequacy, questionable measurement techniques, and observer biased. But there's a lot of critics to a lot of theories. We're just exploring them all. Another area, the general theory of crime, another excellent book. It's also on Amazon if you're interested in exploring this a little further. This is possibly the second most important integrated theory of crime. Two criminologists, Gottfredson and Hursky, they integrate control theory with biosocial, psychological, routine activities, and the rational choice theories. They see the delinquent offender and the delinquent act as two separate concepts. The delinquent act, like robberies and burglaries, are negative acts people do when they think it will be advantageous to them. This is like the rational choice theory. And routine activities in that people weigh rewards and punishments and the accessibility of targets. On the other hand, delinquent offenders are individuals who are predisposed to commit crime. This predisposition remains constant over time, but the opportunity changes. The key element to the general theory of crime is that individuals vary in their tendency to commit crimes. So the question is, what makes people delinquent prone? And this is based on an individual's self-control. People without good self-control tend to be impulsive. Impulsive people are insensitive, physical, risk-taking, short-sighted, and nonverbal. They have an orientation towards immediate gratification and are less likely to feel and or share. Therefore, they're more likely to engage in delinquent acts that they find pleasurable. Similarly, this desire for ease, pleasure can be seen in other non-criminal behaviors as well, like smoking, drinking, gambling, and eliciting sex. So what causes low self-control? Poor self-control can be traced to inadequate child-rearing practices. Parents who don't recognize deviant behavior don't punish it, and therefore they produce kids who have low self-control. Gottfredson and Hirsky say that self-control is developed by the end of childhood and fostered through parental emotional investment in the child, which includes monitoring behavior and recognizing deviance when it occurs, and then punishing that behavior. The lack of self-control is a natural phenomena that will occur unless steps are taken to avoid it. It occurs early in life and will remain stable into and through adulthood. Unlike most other theories that explain narrow aspects of criminal behavior, Gottfredson and Hursky argue that their theory of self-control applies to all crimes, from murder to theft. And I want to direct your attention to Megan Grunwald. The case is cited in the book 141, page 141, under what makes a person delinquent prone. A jury found this teenager, she was 18, but she was 17 at the time of the crime, guilty of a 50-mile crime spree that left one sheriff dead and another wounded. The prosecutors say that she was desperately in love with her much older boyfriend and would do anything to stay with him, including driving a speeding getaway car in a 3-county chase. The teenager tearfully told a jury she was too afraid to stop driving when the man she loved turned the gun on her and threatened to kill her family. Her boyfriend was 27 years old, Jose Angel Garcia. He was actually killed in a shootout with police during this incident. While Megan was found guilty, she was facing and was sentenced to life in prison. And In Utah, they recognized the death penalty, but because she was 17 at the time of the crime, she was ineligible, thankfully, not to be put on death row. A 2-week trial. There was testimony from the sheriff who was shot in the head during the chase, and a woman who pulled her child out of the car as it was stolen at gunpoint, because that's what they had done. They'd taken this car at gunpoint and went on a spree. She took the stand on her own defense. She told the jury that being in the car with Garcia was like looking at a devil, but the prosecutors weren't buying her testimony, saying her story was rife with inconsistencies and the only person who could refute it is dead. The crime spree started after the sheriff happened upon their vehicle pulled over at the side of the road, and Garcia gave the deputy a fake name because there was actually a warrant already out for his arrest. And the sheriff grew suspicious, and Garcia stuck a gun out the truck's window and shot him. Grunwald drove away behind the wheel of a pickup. Prosecutors say that when another deputy caught up with them, she hit the brakes to close the distance between the vehicles, so Garcia had a better shot when he fired again. And that sheriff was the one who was hit in the head, but he survived. He's the one that testified. And prosecutors argued that no obstacle was going to stop her from being with her man. And her denied, saying that she was a scared little girl who trusted this much older, manipulative man, that he had threatened her and she went on autopilot, and then she was speeding around driving the pickup truck with the gun to her head. So the question is, impulsivity, lack of self-control, did those play a role here? Love was the prosecutor's claim. Something else going on. And I will throw in there the defense that she was using duress. She was under duress. She had a gun to her head. He was going to threaten to kill her family. Is actually not a defense. It sounds like it is, but it's not in the case of one life over another. The crime has to be a lot less than that, but that's for another class. But we're talking about what makes people do these things. And the prosecutor in that case was arguing love. So let's testing the general theory of crime. There have been a variety of approaches to test this general theory of crime. Some criminologists have identified indicators of impulsiveness and self-control, and then determined whether these factors correlate with measures of delinquent behavior. According to the general theory of crime, as self-control declines, the likelihood that someone will engage in future antisocial behaviors increases. Low self-control has been linked to a variety of crime types, ranging from texting while driving to serious sex offending. Studies using this approach have found that teens measuring low on self-control are the ones most likely to fall in with a bad crowd. And once they do so, their impulsivity makes them vulnerable to antisocial peer influence. Career criminals have been shown to have significantly lower levels of self-control than non-offenders. But the general theory has been criticized for providing merely a general view of crime that is overly simplistic and ignores the complexity of the criminal process. Human behavior is more complex than that, especially in terms of criminal behavior. And this is according to the critics. Some well-adjusted teens, for example, participate in delinquent behavior during their teen years and become law-abiding citizens once they reach adulthood. Other criticism includes circular reasoning. How do we know when a person is being impulsive? At what point? Impulsivity is only one of many personality traits correlated with crime. There are many others. The theory does not explain racial and gender differences. Even though gender differences exist in the actual official delinquency rate, there's little evidence that males are more impulsive or lacking in self-control than females. So do other traits play a role? The theory overlooks issues of institutional racism, poverty, and relative deprivation. which has been shown to affect the delinquency rate. People change, and so does their self-control. As said above, some well-adjusted teens, for example, participate in delinquent behavior during their teen years, but they become law-abiding citizens once they're adults. But despite the criticism, there is a plausible argument that all deviant behavior may originate from the same source. Continued efforts to test this theory are only going to help establish the validity of these concepts more, and nevertheless, it does remain one of the key developments of modern criminology theory. So that's the general theory of crime. We're going to talk about the third developmental approach, trajectory theory. Like I said, it's the third developmental approach, and it combines the elements of propensity and life course theories. And contrary to most theories, the trajectory theory suggests there isn't just one factor that encourages delinquent behavior, but rather multiple pathways to delinquency, and that there is more than one class of offenders. Furthermore, the trajectory theory believes there are certain paths, i.e. trajectories, that direct a person toward delinquent behavior quicker and at a higher rate than other trajectories. Some people begin at an early age and later become adult offenders, while others begin their violent careers in adulthood, having escaped and or avoided crime as juveniles. As they mature, juveniles who began offending at an early age may later segue into more age-appropriate crimes. The violent adolescence, the schoolyard bully, matures into an abusive husband in adulthood. But they remain violent over the course of their life. Other offenders stay out of trouble in early adolescence and do not begin to violate the law until much later in the life cycle. While some late starters reach their offending peak during adolescence, others persist at a high rate into adulthood. Reasons why some offenders start early, others late, and some not at all may be linked to psychological problems and disturbances. Mental disease and personality disorders progress differently, affecting some people in early adolescence and others later in life. Research shows that offending trajectories do in fact differ among people with mental disorders, creating different classes of offenders. These are early starters, the ES, who begin to engage in antisocial behavior at a young age before the onset of the psychiatric disorder, most likely because they maintain other psychological issues such as antisocial personality. There are also late starters, the LS, who begin to engage in antisocial behavior after the onset of a psychiatric disorder. Their criminal and deviant behavior is attributed to symptoms of that disorder. And then there's another category called first offenders, or FO, and these are people in their late 30s with late onset of a mental disorder, like schizophrenia. They suddenly commit a very serious, unusual, violent offense, unbeknownst to the having a mental disorder. It comes on later in life. Some other possible trajectories toward delinquency have included biological, psychological, sociological, behavioral, and environmental. And we have a spectrum of offending frequency. There's the spectrum of offending frequency ranging from people who have never committed a crime to those who repeatedly commit crime offenses, those chronic offenders. You may recall that discussion from Chapter 2. We talked about how one becomes a chronic offender. Violent delinquents who have a unique set of personality traits and problem behaviors, but also each violent delinquent has his or her own distinct delinquent path. Those kids who stop the behavior in adulthood that continue, but the violence escalates. These escalators, according to research, tend to live in racially mixed communities, experience racism, and have less parental involvement. So what are the pathways to delinquency? There's the trajectory theory, recognizes that criminals may travel more than a single road. Some may commit acts of violence or blackmail. Some may be involved in theft or fraud. Others engage in a number of other delinquent acts. Kids offend at different paces, commit different crimes, and are influenced by different forces. One of the most comprehensive studies to date that have attempted to detail life pathway began in 1986 by Rolf Lober. And the pathways that he identified in his study, there's a graph on page 147 that kind of outlines this. The authority conflict pathway, on which subjects appear to begin quite young, as early as 3 or 4 years old. The first step, say the authors of this study, was stubborn behavior, followed by defiance around the age of 11, and authority avoidance, truancy, staying out late at night, or running away. That's one pathway. The other one was the covert pathway, which begins with minor covert acts, such as frequent lying, shoplifting, and that usually starts around the age of 10. Delinquents follow this path quickly. It progresses to acts of more like property damage, starting fires, vandalism, and that happens around 11 or 12 years old, followed by moderate and more serious forms of delinquency. And then the third path, the overt pathway, in which the first step is marked by minor aggression, such as annoying others and bullying, and this happens around the age of 11 and 12. Bullying was found to escalate into physical fighting and violence as the juvenile progressed along this pathway. The overt pathway eventually leads to violent crimes, such as robbery, rape, and assault. Researchers have found that these three pathways are not necessarily mutually exclusive and can at times converge. Self-report data show that simultaneous progression along two or more pathways leads to higher rates of delinquency that would otherwise occur. Psychologist Terry Moffat proposed that there are two types of juvenile delinquents: life course persistent offenders and adolescent limited offenders. According to Moffat, she contributed to the development theory through her identification of what she refers to as the adolescent limited offenders, and those are adolescents whose antisocial behavior peaks during adolescence and then declines to the point of desistance. These individuals may be referred to as typical teenagers with characteristics of being rebellion, and then they age out of that behavior. The life course persisters, on the other hand, are those individuals who engage in crime and delinquency at a young age, and their behavior sets the stage for a career of offending. These individuals are more likely to manifest additional abnormal traits like low verbal skills, impaired reasoning, and poor memory function. Research suggests that these patterns are persistent and accurate. So what causes this? What's interesting is that, according to Moffat, the causes of juvenile delinquency are different for both these groups. So for the life course persistent versus the adolescent limited offender, the life course persistent offenders may have, for example, genetic or neurological deficits, or they may come from a difficult home environment. They come from problematic backgrounds, and they have certain characteristics that make their risk of offending much higher. On the other hand, according to Moffat, the adolescent limited offenders do not really come from a problematic background. Instead, so many youths commit delinquency in their teenage years that she considers it almost normal. The causes of juvenile delinquency for this group are very different. These kids are suffering from what is called the maturity gap, meaning that these youths are biologically mature, their bodies are almost like an adult body, but they're not allowed to do what adults do. They're not allowed to work, to drive a car, to marry, or to buy alcohol. They're basically dependent on their parents and their family, and they can't make many decisions for themselves. But they want to make their own decisions. And so they may start to steal the things they're not allowed to have and take risks or do things that their parents would never allow them to do. And so they're looking for new challenges to prove that they are more than capable of conquering them. So in this sense, every time a youth does something that adults may think of as bad, for them it is a statement of personal independence. So even though crime peaks in the teenage years for the average person, Moffat's model shows that there are differences between people, whereas for most youths, crime is something that occurs only in teenage years and not thereafter. This is the adolescence limited group of offenders. And there's a small group of people who start to show problem behavior already in childhood and for whom it continues well into adulthood. And this is the group known as the life course persistent offenders. There is a third group, the abstainers. These are kids that never break the law or engage in adolescent misbehavior. We might call them the good kids, but they put them in two groups. Social introverts, their unpopularity is what shields them from peer pressure to commit delinquent acts. And then there's the pro-social abstainers. They abstain from delinquent behavior because of parental monitoring and strong moral beliefs rather than social isolation. But there is the third path to delinquency, and those that do not commit crimes. Here is the pathway to crime set out by Lober. It's also in the book. Put it on the slides for you to review. From here, we are going to next evaluate these developmental theories and discuss delinquency prevention.